know, it may just be me, but I really got a feeling like we could catch fire and have a great season, huh? Now, who's with me?
Woo! The electric in the air!
Sometimes may be good, sometimes may be
The Cleats First, Logic Second Football Podcast with your hosts, Alexander Lauber and Phil Almodovar.
Welcome one and all to the Cleats First Logic Second Football Podcast. We're back again visiting a recurring series on the podcast, what I guess we'll now be dubbing the Road to Redemption series, and today we'll be looking at FC Schalke in the Bundesliga.
Yep, Schalke, a very tragic story in the Bundesliga. A rapid slide that, Alex, we'll get into.
Indeed we will, and why don't we just start right away, Phil, with a brief overview. Tell us a little bit about FC Schalke.
Yes, FC Schalke was founded in 1904. They play in the German Bundesliga in Gelsenkirchen, Germany. Schalke being a small territory of Gelsenkirchen, which they play in, much like Dortmund is. They have won the Bundesliga 7 times, the DFB Pokal, which is the major cup in Germany, 5 times, and the Champions League once in 1996-1997. So, Alex, they are a very storied club. Of course, most of their success being in the past.
No, absolutely. Like you said, a very storied club. If we look on the ownership side, FC Schalke is owned by its members or shareholders. The team has over 155,000 shareholders worldwide, which is the 4th most in the world. It's normally self-sustaining. However, they are in 200 million euros of debt due to a combination of bad financial moves and the COVID-19 pandemic. Despite everything, though, from the poor moves to the lack of internal savings, not much can be done about ownership when there is no real majority owner. So why don't we just move on and discuss the managers?
Yeah, Alex, let's go straight into the managers, which you could definitely look at as part of the problem, as part of Schalke's big fall from grace. Now, Schalke, like I said, with most of its biggest successes in the past, they still had been finishing in the top 6 in the Bundesliga consistently in the 2000s, boasting some great players and great managers up until manager David Wagner took over, German-American manager. He took over a struggling Schalke side in 2019, which was looking from the outside of the top 6 in at the time. And he basically wanted to turn the squad around, get Schalke back into the top 6 in the Bundesliga. That was his goal. Unfortunately, the opposite of that happened. Once the restart happened after the COVID-19 pandemic really sprung to life, after the restart, he led Schalke down an 18-match winless run. He did not win a single match in 18 matches to end the Bundesliga season. He was sacked in September of 2020 after losing to Werder Bremen 3-1, who at the time, Werder Bremen were in 16th place in the Bundesliga. We then go to the next manager. Manuel Baum was brought in 2020, September of 2020, after the firing of David Wagner for a 2-year contract originally. His main goal was to right the ship going into the 2020-2021 Bundesliga season, get Schalke back on the right track. He proceeded to go winless in his first 10 matches with the club, losing 6 and drawing 4. And he was sacked just 2 months into his stint with Schalke. Now, he wasn't an interim manager. He was brought in to be a permanent solution and was sacked after just 2 months. Then we go to Hub Stevens. Hub Stevens was brought in as an interim manager, so he was already within the club after Baum got sacked. And he only managed one Bundesliga league match, which ended up being a 1-0 defeat to newly promoted Bielefeld, and a 28th straight match without a victory thereafter in the following match. After those two matches, he then proceeded to be replaced by now current manager of FC Schalke, Christian Gross, who is a Swiss manager, has a lot of managing experience. He was brought in on December 27th, 2020, and since has won a match this past weekend. Before that, he had led the team to its 31st straight match without a win. That's tied for the most in Bundesliga history. Fortunately for Schalke, they did not set a new record. They were able to win 4-0 over Hoffenheim this past weekend. Gross's first win with the club. Schalke are currently 17th in the Bundesliga under Gross, just one position up from where they were before the weekend, which was 18th. Alex, a real carousel of managers.
Yeah, like you said, there's definitely been a ridiculous amount of ins and outs at the manager, and it wasn't until this past weekend then things seemed to click. Ironically, in the Bundesliga transfer bonanza, we discussed Schalke too, and I had made the suggestion to look to bring in Sead Kolasinac. He started his first match this weekend. They won 4-0 at Hoffenheim. Definitely a big leader, someone very passionate about FC Schalke, having grown up in the academy. We saw them get over the line finally, win their first match. They're finally not last in the Bundesliga anymore. We'll see if they can continue some form, find a good run of form, continually sustained, and move forward. From there, let's move on to the philosophy of the club. And over the entire history of FC Schalke, they're a club that refuses to play Moneyball. Their business decisions when it comes to the selling of players or letting players walk on a free, it's very questionable. So let's go over some notable graduates of FC Schalke's academy who have left the club. So over the last 10 years, Manuel Neuer has left FC Schalke, having grown through the academy. Julian Draxler, Joel Matip, Leroy Sané, Sead Kolasinac, Max Meyer, Benedikt Hövedes, and Theo Kehrer. Of those players, Manuel Neuer was sold above his estimated value as reported by Transfermarkt. He was valued at the time at 28 million euros, sold for 30 million. Julian Draxler, another prophet, valued at 22 million, sold for a whopping 43 million euros to Wolfsburg. Joel Matip, on the other hand, left on a free to Liverpool. And we all know what happened with Joel Matip. Even though he wasn't a center stone in the club, he went on to play at Liverpool, win the Champions League, win the Premier League, and while not being a center point of that club, being a fixture in the defense there, and his value has peaked significantly. Leroy Sané, someone who went up through the academy, like we said, valued at 30 million euros, sold to Manchester City for 52, so at a good profit. Sead Kolasinac left when his contract expired in 2017 to Arsenal on a free, valued at 15 million euros at the time. Max Meyer left on a free as well, valued at 18 million euros in August of 2018 to Crystal Palace on a free. Benedikt Hövedes left to Lokomotiv Moscow for 5 million euros when valued at 9 million. And Theo Kehrer was sold for 37 million euros when he was valued at 18 million to PSG. So a good profit there. as we'll see, Phil, there were a number of notable players on this team and notable players who have left Schalke in the last 10 years who have left on freeze, who had either a significant market value at the time or, again, were these young prospects who just walked, or young cornerstones that just walked and were never replaced.
Yeah, Alex, and that's going to be a main issue. Like I said before, management definitely is an issue, but it's absolutely detrimental to a club when you're losing top quality talent for little to nothing in return. And that's the story of FC Schalke.
Yeah, if we look at, again, these notable transfers in the last 10 years, if we look at every player who either left on a free or for one reason or another had their contract terminated, in the case of, I believe, 2 on this list, if you add up those values based off of their market value at the time of their departure from the club, FC Schalke let 142.5 million euros worth of players walk on freeze. If you look, just looking at the list, there are some older names that a lot of us won't be familiar with. Some more notable. Kevin Prince Boateng was signed from AC Milan for 10 million euros in August of 2013. In December of 2015, his contract was terminated due to disciplinary issues, but nonetheless, we know he continued to play after that. He had a transfer value of 3 million euros at the time of his termination. Christian Fuchs, for example, was signed for 3.8 million euros and let walk on a free 4 years after his signing in July of 2015. And Phil, we all know the story of Christian Fuchs and what happened then. He went to the Premier League, went to Leicester City, and helped them win the Premier League that season, being a cornerstone of that defense. If you look at some other notable players who left on freeze, like I said, Joel Matip before, Eric Choupo-Moting left the club, but it seems he's a weird exception. It's funny looking at his transfer history. Fun fact, he's never been transferred, or he's never transferred for one club from one club to another for a transfer fee. It's always been on freeze. And that's the really strange thing, because every club that Eric Choupo-Moting has played at, he hasn't been, the center sword, but he's always been a really good serviceable piece. We saw that at PSG. We're seeing that at Bayern this season. We saw that at Stoke when he was there. Sead Kolasinac, like we said, was valued at 15 million euros. Max Meyer, 18 million. And Leon Goretzka left on a free in the summer of 2018 to Bayern Munich. At the time, he was valued at 40 million euros. I believe now he's in the neighborhood of 60 million euros of his net valuation. But we all know he's a world-class player and a world-class talent who walked away for absolutely nothing. And if we look in even more recent history, which explains some of their trouble this season, Alexander Nubel, their starting goalkeeper the last couple of seasons, walked away on a free last summer to Bayern Munich, valued at 9.5 million euros at the time. So they lost their starting goalkeeper, and we'll look at the roster shortly, they never replaced him. And then if you look at the offense, and FC Schalke has only scored 11 goals so far this season, 4 of them coming this past match, so 7 before them. A huge reason behind this, 2 of their offensive cornerstones, Daniel Caligiuri and Guido Burgstaller, both left the club this past season on freeze. They were both the starting left winger and right winger respectively. Caligiuri playing 28 matches in the Bundesliga, the team collecting 1.29 points per game when he played. And as for Burgstaller, 21 matches played, 1.43 points per game while he was in the roster. So 2 crucial pieces there. And like we see, Phil, not a lot of moves were made to account for any of them leaving.
Yeah, and that's important, especially when you have some of these players being great role players. Aside from maybe some exceptions being Manuel Neuer, I mean, he's a generational talent. You could say the same possibly about Leon Goretzka. He'll get there maybe, who knows? But some of these players, like you said, Alex, Christian Fuchs, Joel Matip, Eric Choupo-Moting, Sead Kolasinac, these players all were very good at playing in their role, and you could see it, maybe not so much from Kolasinac, but from Choupo-Moting, from Fuchs, and from Matip, being that they went from Schalke to clubs that were very successful. Just shows their value while they're at Schalke. They were those role players at Schalke. Yeah, they weren't stars, but they were role players. They fit a certain pedigree that Schalke was able to use in order to stay up in that top six, to stay competitive. And once they left and really were never replaced, it all fell apart. And Alex, let's look at that current roster.
Yeah, so if we look at the current roster, their goalkeeping situation, the youngest of the three is Frederick Rono, who's on loan at the club, 28 years of age. The other two, Ralph Farman, 32, and Michael Langer, 36. Their goalkeeping situation, none of them have been playing phenomenal, and it doesn't look great, being that none of them are getting younger, and the youngest of the three and the focal point of the club's goalkeeping is there on loan. So that's definitely one big red flag, and the first of which that pops up instantly looking at this club's roster.
Yeah, absolutely, Alex. And we'll talk more into this, but for FC Schalke, another big problem when you look at how they do business is the loans. You look at who they have on loan right now, going to that goalkeeper position. I'll leave the rest to be said, Alex. We're going to go through it. Marcus Schubert really was supposed to be the goalkeeper to take the mantle when Nubel left. And Schubert did play a few matches for Schalke. Wasn't really anything too exciting, too impressing. He was supposed to be the next guy. He was supposed to be just as good. He didn't really show it. And guess where he is now? Even though he did underperform, I think it's a bad move for Schalke to have let him go on loan. He's currently playing at Eintracht Frankfurt. Not sure, Alex, I don't know if you know this, if he's actually starting at Frankfurt, but he is currently away from FC Schalke.
Yeah, no, I don't believe he's played any matches at Frankfurt. Kevin Trapp has been starting, I believe, all of them for them. But, he's young enough that I believe actually Rono is at Schalke on loan from Frankfurt, so they'll be swapping back keepers at the end of the season. So it'll be interesting to see how he jumps back in next season. Good point there. It'll be interesting to see what the situation is with the keepers. But like you said, actually, just because we're on the topic of players out on loan, if you look at the players out on loan, the biggest mistake on the list there, we'll jump to the center midfield. You have both Weston McKennie and Sebastian Rudy out on loan. One of the biggest problems that we'll see with this FC Schalke roster is a lack of experience. With Sebastian Rudy, you have exactly that. A 30-year-old defensive-minded midfielder out on loan at Hoffenheim, but someone too who, with the experience he has playing for Bayern Munich and whatnot, is more than capable of helping to mentor and helping to be a cornerstone in this midfield. I don't really see the logic behind loaning him out, especially in a season that you've proved to be struggling. Again, mind you, he is out injured at the moment, but as January progresses, could that be another option to look to terminate that loan, bring him back, and try and reintegrate him into the first team squad? When it comes to McKennie, it looks like he might just be a write-off completely. When he was loaned out, his value at the time was 20 million euros. It's raised since to 25 million. Interesting to see how his career has advanced there. It seems like Andrea Pirlo is very fond of him, and he's fitting in nicely at Juventus. And I don't see him coming back to Schalke since an 18 million euro release clause was put into his contract. So the 18 million plus the 4.5 million euro loan fee, 22.5 million euros coming into Schalke for Weston McKennie, but losing in turn a phenomenal young talent. I mean, not much you can say there. Obviously, they spotted the potential in him, but there was really no knowing that he was going to blow up this season the way that he did.
Yeah, I mean, Alex, coming from a U.S. national team super fans perspective, I love to see what Weston McKennie's been able to do at Juventus. And I'll say this, Weston McKennie didn't have the same pieces around him at FC Schalke that he does have now at Juventus. He's playing with players now like Cristiano Ronaldo and Alvaro Morata, players that are much more capable on the attack than he ever saw at FC Schalke. And Weston McKennie was playing more of a defensive role at Schalke, more of a central midfield role. Now at Juventus, he's been more involved in the attack. He has been playing in the central midfield, but he's also been played out on the wing in the attacking midfield position for Juventus. So he's been more involved. He's been given better players around him by Juventus to play with. And of course, him being a solid player, he has shown that with solid players around him, he could really excel. And he has done just that. His value has skyrocketed and will continue to go up as long as he keeps on playing the way he has. And for Schalke, like you said, Alex, 22.5 million, depending on how much better McKennie could play or how long he could keep up this run of form, that value could go up exponentially and really hurt Schalke in the end.
Yeah, but if you look at Schalke's current midfield, it's not all bleak. Let's just run through the names quickly. Omar Mascarell, Suat Serdar, Nabil Bentaleb, Nassim Bouhaleb, Alessandro Schampf, Karim Chahanoglu, Amini Harit, Can Bozdogan, Levent Merkan. Of those group, the young players like Amin Harit went off this past weekend with a goal and 3 assists, I believe. So there's a lot of young potential and young talent in that midfield. But looking at the average age, the oldest player of the group is 27. It seems like the midfield especially is lacking experience and lacking a pure leader to help guide these young players. It is slightly concerning. I think that might be an area to address. And, maybe if you can bring in either, like I suggested in the Transfer Bonanza special, a more experienced midfielder, someone like a Max Meyer, who's fallen out of favor at Crystal Palace, or a Julian Draxler on loan. Granted, I think they'll probably look to sell him, being that his contract's out at PSG in the summer. I think regardless, though, it's definitely worth looking to invest there and try and strengthen that. Because if you look back at the defense, and we'll just run through the list really quickly. Center back, there are 6 center backs on the team. Ozan Kabak, Matija Nastatic, Salif Sane, Benjamin Stambouli, Malik Thia, and Timo Becker. Of that group, Kabak stands out as one of the shining lights, a young kid with a ton of potential. We know he's been linked to a number of Premier League sides and sides across Europe. So it'll be interesting to see if they can hold on to him. Granted, it doesn't look like he'll be walking on a free because his contract expires in 2024. So if he leaves the club, he'll be leaving for a nice price tag beforehand. Then on the wing, or on the left and right side of the defense, on the left side, you have Sead Kolasinac, Hamza Mendel, Bastian Ochipka, and Killian Ludwig. So obviously Kolasinac coming in on loan. Ludwig is in on loan as well. So that's another area of concern. Definitely need more players and more players there permanently to address these positions. Kolasinac obviously bringing in a fresh, a jolt of invigoration into that roster. I think there's a lot of good pieces there, and looking at the next 6 months with the main goal being staying up in the Bundesliga, I think they have pieces there, but there's still a lot to be desired.
Yeah, and like you said, Alex, you look at this roster, you see a lot of youth. You don't see a whole lot of experience. Matthew Hop, 19 years old. Ahmed Katuchu, 20 years old. I mean, I'm just looking at players that play consistently for the squad at the moment. Suat Serdar, 23 years old. Emini Harit, 23 years old. Kabak is only 20. There's not a whole lot of guidance aside from that back line. In that back line, of course, you got Salif Sanye and Matija Nastasic, who both do rotate in at that center back position to provide guidance to Kabak. You also, like you said, Alex, have Sead Kolasinac back, who is a key veteran piece there as well. I think, Alex, if we start to turn to, if it's okay with you, the solutions, our proposed solutions, where I think you're kind of getting at a key point. There needs to be more veteran help because we've seen the promise that some of these young players have. And Kabak is one of those players that, with that veteran help, currently at the moment, he's starting to realize his potential just a little bit. And that defensive line, really, for me, isn't the problem for Schalke in terms of players. If you look at the midfield and the attack, the creativity, Suat Serdar, 23, Harit, 23, Katuchu, 20, Hop, 19, they don't really have that same guidance around them. I mean, you have Mark Uth, but he hasn't really played at 29 years old. He does have a lot of experience, but he hasn't really played all too much for the club. You need to get some more help there, especially maybe in the midfield. There are some great names. Suat Serdar really was the best among the bad on that terrible losing run after the restart. He was still producing. He was still getting assists, scoring goals. It's just that he was assisting and scoring the only goals that the club was scoring week in and week out. You know, it's tough when that onus is put on you as a player who, at the time, Serdar was only 22 years old. And now we look at a Matthew Hop who came in last weekend and scored a hat trick. He's only 19. If he starts being told, okay, kid, good job. We expect you to put out performances, maybe not like that, but great performances every week. That's tough for a young player.
Yeah, it definitely doesn't look easy. And if you look at the center forward position starting off, Mark Uth has gone the majority of the starts. He's played 11 matches, started all 11 of them. His scoring hasn't been phenomenal. He scored 2 goals in those 11 appearances. Like you said, is it realistic to expect that much from Matt Hop? Probably not. But if you can continue to focus that midfield and that attack around your Matt Hops, your Amin Harit, players like that, and just support them, I think there's a lot of potential there and raw potential in the club. But like we've said, and like we've been harping on repeatedly, when your oldest players in the roster are 27, I think the oldest player who starts regularly is a Chipka, and he's 31. Leadership does look to be a question on the pitch. I mean, if you look at the numbers superficially, Phil, 11 squad goals have been scored when they've conceded 36.
Yeah, and that's massive, Alex. And 11 goals in the time span that we've played already is just a minuscule number. You have clubs like Bayern who, if I were to guess, I don't know the exact number, I would guess they've at least tripled that number at this point in time in the season. And yes, I'm talking about a Bayern club who are juggernauts compared to Schalke. But if you look at where they're supposed to be, you look at clubs like Wolfsburg, like Leverkusen, like Dortmund, who are in that top 6. They are able to put out players who are able to score. They are able to put out good young talent, but they also do have great veteran players around them. You look at right now, Bayer Leverkusen, a club that's excelling in the Bundesliga, they have good young talent, but you look in that midfield too, along with the Leon Baileys and the Marion Wirtzes of the world. You also have Baumgartlinger in that midfield, who's 32 years old, I believe, anchoring that squad still. You really don't have that veteran leadership right now at Schalke.
Yeah, to your point on the goal differential and points, Schalke have the second least amount of goals for in the Bundesliga. Armenia has scored 9. They've scored 12. They're in 17th. Armenia is in 16th. And Cologne, who's just out of the relegation zone in 15th, has 13. And then Mainz, who are at the bottom of the table, have 14-4. When you look at goals against, Schalke owns the title of worst record. They have 39 goals against, followed by Mainz with 33. Then 14th place Hoffenheim 30, Cologne 27, Armenia 24, and there's several teams with 24 goals against, including the champions Bayern Munich. But if you look at goal differential, they sit dead last with negative 27. The next lowest number is Mainz with negative 19. Schalke's just been a bit luckier and managed to get one more draw, and that's what separates them from the bottom of the table. But I mean, 1 point there. You know, it's definitely going to be a close race. Mainz 6 points, Schalke 7, Armenia 10, and then Cologne 11. It gets a little bit bigger there. Bremen and Hoffenheim with 15. So, is it impossible? No, but I don't think you'll get a lot of matches like the one this past week. I don't think it's realistic to move forward with the same squad and the same tactics. I mean, granted, again, you've had 4 managers this season. Give the current one some time to work with the club, get the best out of his players that he can. Again, for Schalke's sake, if they can keep a roll of form going, maybe you can turn things around, but I do think that this squad leaves a lot to be desired when it comes to, like we've said, and we've been harping on, leadership first and foremost, but secondly, experience in, namely, the midfield.
Yeah, Alex, and that's one of the things I want to bring up too in my possible solutions. Like I said about Arsenal when we talked about them, this is not an easy fix. This is going to take a long time to get back on track. This is just a fall from grace, really. And when you look at the manager role here, when you have 4 different managers in the span of, not even in the span of a year, in the span of months, that really could be a huge hit to the morale of the club as a whole, not being under one real path of guidance, having been put on different ones month after month. And when you look at the newest manager right now, Christian Gross, he has experience. He knows how to keep teams up in the first division of leagues. I would at least ride him out till the end of the season at this point and see what he could do. See if maybe he could string a few wins together and get you out of relegation at the very least, and then maybe even think about extending him long term and seeing if he could be the answer to starting to get you back on track. But I don't think the answer definitely is, if Gross doesn't immediately turn things around, getting rid of him, even if that does mean getting relegated, because just the toll that having multiple managers in a short period of time has on a club's morale is awful.
Yeah, and I think one of the other big things too, when a club sacks their manager and brings in a new one, you naturally expect a bounce from the players. You expect players to say, okay, we have this new manager. It brings out a little extra something in them and they just happen to perform better. When your managers are spending short stints there, again, you can't really blame Hoob Stevens. He was only there for a match interim, or one Bundesliga match, I should say. I think you do have to put the faith in Gross. I think, like you said, he needs to at least stay till the end of the season. If you do get relegated, make the decision there whether he's the one to bring you back up or you have to go in another direction. But I think you do need to show faith in him. And yes, the club tends to be self-sustaining, like you said, and doesn't have any individual to inject it with money to make these big moves. But even on the loan market, Schalke has to go out there, shop around, and see. I don't know if it's feasible for them to take on any wage budgets, but I'm certain that there are clubs who are just sitting on players who would be relieved to move them out. And even if you're not taking on 100% of, or even if you're not alleviating yourself 100% of that player's wage and you have to split with Schalke, I'm sure that'll do some clubs good. I don't know. It seems like a large task, and like we said, as much as you can look at teams, and as we will throughout the series, and as we will shortly in future episodes, you can say, okay, and like we did with the Arsenal, you can say, oh, if only owner X reached into their pockets and threw money at the club, and they made these signings that the managers wanted, they would succeed. Obviously, there's no set person here to do that, but something that needs to be fixed is these bad transfer habits. You can't keep letting players leave on a free, especially if they're, one, crucial to your roster, and two, crucial to the long-term success on frees. Like we said, any value would be ridiculous, but 140 plus million euros in the last 10 years of players just walking out on frees, you can't let it go to that. If they don't re-sign, I don't know, put some practice into effect, sit them down a year and a half before their contract expires, say, are you going to re-sign? Yes or no? You have till date X, otherwise we're shopping you around. Shop them around actively, even if you have to take a loss or you have to take not a reduced rate as to what you want. You have to sell these players. They can't keep walking away on frees, because it's this recurring cycle. And what's going to happen? You're going to keep bringing in players like a Leon Goretzka. And yes, I mean, if you look at the other academy kids that we mentioned before, they were able to make good profits on a number of them. But for all of those big transfers, if you keep letting these little ones walk away with the odd Leon Goretzka or Joel Matip or what have you, the numbers add up and you'll start countering the big money that you're making off your sales with all these losses, and you're net neutral at the end.
Yeah, Alex, the culture definitely has to change in that regard. And I think being 2 million euros in debt could be the slap in the face that Schalke needs, whether that debt being mostly incurred by the COVID-19 pandemic, which it is. You do have to attain some of it to bad business. And the only way that you can turn that around is starting it with some of the good young players that you have, especially if they start to really turn out. Them, of course, being your Kabaks, your Harits, Hoop, Kutucu, those players who are said now to be the future and now are going to be starting to get some eye candy from the Premier League, bigger teams in the Bundesliga, and elsewhere. You have to be aware of that. And you have to put these good practices in now and say to yourself, well, we don't want to get nothing for these players. We don't want to get nothing for Kabak if his value inflates. He's one of the best center backs coming out of the Bundesliga. We don't want to let him go on a free to a team that's going to use him to win a championship, to win a title. And if he is going to leave to a team that does that, we're going to want the proper compensation for it in order to replace him. It's a whole systematic issue, which, Alex, as we know in sports, is a very hard one to fix.
Yeah, because I don't think it's an issue to look at a system like Schalke has and say, okay, well, we're going to focus on primarily bringing up youth academy players and injecting them into the roster. But like I said, if you look at last season, 3 of your 11 left. And that doesn't account for other players who were sold or other players who were left. But of your primary 3 of the 11 who left the roster, if you're just injecting 18-year-old kids into that position or a 28-year-old lone goalkeeper, in the case of Rano, like, if you're not accounting for the players that you're going to be losing, or you're not going into it and saying, okay, well, we're not going to guarantee that this is the timeline, but realistically, let's expect that player X, as soon as they get called up, are going to spend 2 or 3 years on the senior team, then we'll sell them for a profit and move on. If you decide to take that route, because I think that's plenty viable, you just have to make sure that you have plenty of quality coming up or enough good players in the youth academy to mitigate the risks of losing an Alexander Nubel or something like that. And again, like we've mentioned, there is potential with Marcus Schubert, who's currently out on loan, but that's one of several positions, of long-term concern. But as far as, like we said, for this season, it's just, I think you can't patch over mistakes, or you can't patch over the cracks forever. But for a team like FC Schalke, especially with the financial woes, I think you might have to do patchwork when it comes to, bringing in these experienced players on loan, but begin the systematic changes to say, okay, well, this is the steps we're going to take to move forward to not make these same mistakes that we have season after season. And while we won't be able to throw in a bunch of money right now to address them, at least have the framework together that once profits start coming back in that have been lost due to the pandemic, then you start addressing them more aggressively at that point.
Alex, I think that is a great way to wrap up this conversation. I think we both agree that the solution for Schalke, even though it is one that's going to take time, is a very clear one. Alex, it was a lot of fun today talking about the fall of Schalke and if there could be redemption. Who knows? After we talked about Arsenal, Alex, Arsenal gained some form, so you never know. Maybe Schalke will win their next 3 matches. We'll have to see. Alex, and just to finish off, some key announcements. Alex, why don't you let everyone know what's going on with Cleats First, Logic Second?
Yeah, I mean, again, to wrap up that point, it'll be interesting to see how Schalke proceeds from here. We'll definitely look back at the end of the season to see how they were able to address it and if they were able to find any success in staying up. When it comes to Cleats First, Logic Second, what we'll be looking to do now is we're going to be moving the must-watch match of the weeks from the podcast onto Instagram and IGTV. So keep an eye out at Cleats, then THEN Logic on Instagram, where on Tuesdays we'll be delivering to you our reviews of the previous week's match or previous week's predictions and presenting our must-watch matches of the following week. In addition to that, what we'll be looking to do on Fridays is a football in 3-minute weekly wrap-up. So in that, we'll be going over the news of the week, events, transfers, announcements, and so on, just to give you your brief recap of everything that is going on in the world of football. So from there, that wraps up today's podcast. We'll be back next week to continue with the Royal ROI series, where we'll be moving over to France and discussing a team that's been a big seller the last couple of seasons, Lille. And while selling, that's a team that is doing what Schalke could be doing while they're doing it more on the buying side. We'll discuss that further, but a team that's made amazing profits from their sales nonetheless.
Yes, Alex, I can't wait to talk with you about Lille and their success in the transfer market. Until then, have a great week, and remember, meet first, soccer second.